The lonely widow everyone hates offered to work for food at his farm. Now she's sleeping in his bed. The sun had barely risen over the small village when the farmer noticed a figure slowly walking along the dusty road that led to his farm. She moved with a quiet determination, yet there was a heaviness about her steps, a sense of someone who had carried the weight of the world on her shoulders. The farmer had heard of her before. She was the widow everyone in the village whispered about, the woman who had lived alone since her husband passed away years ago. People said she was difficult, unkind, and even unlucky. Children ran away when she passed, and neighbors would cross the street rather than greet her. Despite all this, here she was, coming toward his farm with nothing but a small bundle of belongings and a steady gaze. She approached the gate slowly, her eyes scanning the farm with both curiosity and caution. The farmer, a tall man with broad shoulders and sun-tanned skin from years of working under the harsh sun, stood near the barn, leaning on a wooden rake. He watched her approach, unsure what to expect. His farm had been struggling lately. Crops had failed more than once, and he had been barely keeping up with the work. Any help would be welcome, yet the rumors about her made him hesitate. Still, he reminded himself that judging someone before meeting them was unfair, even if the villagers insisted she was trouble. When she finally reached the gate, she stopped and looked at him directly. Her eyes, sharp and clear, seemed to hold stories of sorrow and survival. She spoke softly, her voice steady but tinged with sadness. "I can work," she said simply. "I have no food, no home. I will work for food and shelter, and I will not ask for more." The farmer felt a flicker of something he had not felt in a long time, curiosity mixed with caution. He studied her closely. She wore plain, worn clothes, and her hair, streaked with gray, was pulled back loosely. Her hands were rough, marked with the lines of hard labor, and yet she moved with a quiet grace that suggested strength and resilience. There was something in her presence that made him think she might be different from the stories the villagers told. After a long pause, he nodded. "I have work," he said, his voice steady but careful. "You can start with the animals. If you do well, you can stay." She nodded once, a small, almost invisible motion, and set down her bundle. Without asking for directions, she began to move toward the barn, her steps purposeful. The farmer followed at a distance, observing her closely. She began with the chores without complaint, feeding the chickens first, then the cows, and finally gathering firewood. Each movement was careful, precise, and efficient. The farmer realized that she knew how to work hard and that she was not asking for charity. She wanted to earn her place. As the day passed, the farmer found himself watching her more than he had intended. There was a quiet dignity in the way she worked, a patience that contrasted sharply with the impatience he had seen in many villagers who complained when asked to lift a basket or clean a stall. Despite the stories he had heard about her, she was polite, careful, and observant. She seemed to notice small details others would have ignored, like a loose nail on the barn door or a broken handle on a bucket. She fixed them quietly, without asking for help or recognition. By the evening, the farmer found himself offering her a simple meal. She accepted it with gratitude, but there was no pride in her expression, only a quiet relief. As they ate in the small kitchen of his farmhouse, she spoke briefly about her past, not in the way of complaining, but in small glimpses of her life. She mentioned her husband's passing, the loneliness of the village, and the struggles she had faced since. The farmer listened, understanding that the woman before him had faced hardships most people could not imagine. That night, the farmer could not sleep. He thought about the widow, her quiet strength, and the unusual calm she brought to his farm. He wondered why the villagers had judged her so harshly. Perhaps they had never looked closely enough, or perhaps their fear of the unknown had made them cruel. He realized that she was not the troublemaker they had painted her to be, but a woman who had survived much and still carried herself with dignity. The next morning, she woke early, as she had every morning since arriving. Before the sun had fully risen, she was already tending to the animals, repairing fences, and preparing the fields. Her work was steady, and the farmer felt a growing respect for her. She did not complain about the hard work or the long hours. Instead, she moved with a quiet determination, completing every task with care and precision. As the day went on, the farmer began to talk to her more, asking about her experiences, her thoughts, and even her small hopes for the future. She answered honestly with a humility that was striking. There was no pretense, no attempt to impress, only sincerity. The farmer found himself drawn to her honesty and the calm way she faced life, even after so much loss. Despite the hard work and the long hours, a subtle bond began to form between them. The farmer noticed that she would sometimes glance at him when he was not looking, a fleeting expression that hinted at curiosity or perhaps a desire for connection. He felt a strange mix of emotions, admiration, concern, and something he could not quite name. For the first time in many years, he found himself thinking about someone other than the farm, the crops, or the endless chores. The villagers continued their gossip, as they always did. They whispered when they saw her at the market, and they shook their heads when they heard she was working on the farmer's land. But he no longer paid attention to their words. He had seen the widow for who she truly was, not who others said she was. He had seen her strength, her resilience, and her willingness to work honestly for her survival. In that moment, the farmer understood that people were often judged unfairly, and that sometimes those who were most shunned by society carried the greatest lessons in humility and courage. By the end of the first week, the farmer had made a decision. He would continue to let her stay and work, regardless of what the villagers said. He had seen the value of her presence not just in her work, but in the calm, steadfast energy she brought to his farm. She was no longer just a stranger at the gate. She was becoming part of the rhythm of life on the farm, and he found that he looked forward to seeing her each morning, listening to her quiet observations and sharing the small moments that made life on the farm bearable. As the sun set on the seventh day, the farmer walked to the barn and watched her tending to the animals. She paused for a moment, looking at the horizon, her face softened by the warm glow of the evening sun. There was a sense of peace about her, a quiet acceptance of life's challenges. The farmer felt a deep respect for her courage and determination, realizing that in offering her a place to work, he had also given himself an opportunity to see beyond rumors, to understand a human story, and perhaps to begin a new chapter in both their lives. That night, as he lay in his bed, the farmer thought about the widow's arrival and the week that had passed. He knew that this was only the beginning. There were challenges ahead, misunderstandings to navigate, and emotions to explore. But for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of hope. Hope that life could change in unexpected ways, that a stranger could become a companion, and that even in a world full of judgment and whispers, kindness and understanding could create something beautiful. And so, the lonely widow, feared and misunderstood by everyone, had quietly entered the farmer's life. She had offered her hands for work and her heart for trust. And in return, the farmer had offered her a chance, not just to survive, but to be seen, respected, and perhaps, one day, even loved. The morning sun rose slowly over the farm, casting long, golden shadows across the fields. The widow was already up, moving quietly through the barn, feeding the chickens and gathering fresh water for the cows. Her hands, though worn from years of hard work, moved with a surprising delicacy, as if she could feel the life in each animal she tended. The farmer watched her from the doorway, noting the focus and care she put into every small task. Despite the villagers, warnings, and rumors, he could not deny the obvious skill and dedication she possessed. It had been several weeks since she first arrived. The farm, once neglected and struggling, now had a rhythm and energy that was new. The crops seemed healthier, the animals more content, and the barn in better condition than it had been in years. Yet, while her work impressed him, the farmer remained cautious. He had seen people deceive others before, and though she seemed honest, he wanted to ensure that this was not temporary. As she moved from task to task, the widow occasionally glanced toward him. Her eyes were calm but observant, taking note of his movements, his expressions, and even the small gestures that revealed his personality. The farmer, in turn, found himself studying her more than he realized. There was a quiet strength in her posture, a sense of resilience that could only come from enduring loss and hardship. He could see why the villagers feared her, yet he also understood that fear was often a result of misunderstanding. One afternoon, as the sun reached its peak and the air became heavy with heat, the widow worked on repairing a fence that had been damaged in a recent storm. Her hands were blistered, and sweat ran down her face, but she did not complain. The farmer offered to help, but she shook her head politely. "I can manage," she said. "This is my responsibility now." There was no arrogance in her words, only a quiet determination to do her part. The farmer admired her perseverance. He realized that this woman, whom the villagers had labeled as difficult or unpleasant, had a pride in her work that was rare. She did not seek praise or recognition. She simply wanted to contribute and earn her keep. Watching her, he began to feel a sense of respect that went beyond the practical help she provided. He was beginning to see her as someone who could be trusted, someone who understood the value of hard work and honesty. Despite their growing respect for one another, tension still lingered. The villagers' gossip had not stopped, and sometimes the widow would return from the market with a look of quiet frustration or sadness. They would whisper cruel things about her behind her back, casting doubt on her character and questioning why she had chosen to work at the farmer's farm. On some days, she would speak to the farmer in hushed tones about the rumors, expressing her weariness at being judged for things she had no control over. The farmer would listen patiently, offering simple words of reassurance. "They do not know you," he would say. "What matters is what we see here together." Slowly, small moments of connection began to emerge between them. One evening, after a long day of work, the farmer found the widow sitting on the porch steps, her hands resting in her lap as she watched the sun dip below the horizon. He joined her silently, carrying a small pitcher of water. She accepted it with a faint smile, and they sat together, sharing the quiet peace of the evening. They did not speak much at first, simply letting the silence stretch comfortably between them. In that silence, a mutual understanding began to form, a recognition of shared endurance, of lives shaped by struggle, and of the simple comfort of companionship. As the days passed, their conversations grew longer. The widow spoke of her past, not as a complaint, but as a story of survival. She told the farmer about her husband, who had been kind but frail, and the loneliness that had followed his passing. She shared her experiences of being shunned by the village, explaining that people often feared what they did not understand. The farmer, in turn, spoke of the challenges of running the farm alone, the uncertainty of the crops, and the constant worry for the animals. Through these exchanges, they began to see each other not as strangers, but as individuals shaped by life's hardships. One morning, a sudden storm swept across the farm. Dark clouds rolled in, and rain began to pour, turning the dirt paths into slippery mud. The widow did not hesitate. She ran to the barn, securing the animals and making sure none of the equipment was damaged. The farmer was amazed by her speed and efficiency. Even in the chaos of the storm, she remained calm and focused, her hands steady and her mind alert. Together, they worked through the worst of the weather, and when the rain finally eased, the farm had survived with minimal damage. That stormy afternoon marked a turning point. The farmer realized that her value went beyond her work. She had a rare combination of strength, intelligence, and resilience that made her a true partner in every sense. He began to trust her instincts and rely on her judgment, knowing that she could handle difficult situations with composure. At the same time, the widow began to feel a sense of belonging she had not experienced in years. She was no longer an outcast, judged by whispers and rumors. She was part of a team built on mutual respect and shared purpose. Evenings became a time of subtle companionship. After the chores were done, they would sit together, sometimes talking, sometimes simply listening to the sounds of the farm, the rustle of leaves in the wind, the lowing of cows, the distant call of a bird returning to its nest. These moments, though quiet, were powerful. The farmer found himself smiling more often, laughing at her dry humor and appreciating the warmth of her presence. The widow, in turn, felt a sense of safety and acceptance that she had not known in a long time. Yet, despite the growing bond, both remained cautious. They were aware of the past, aware of the scars that life had left on them. Neither wanted to rush into trust or emotional closeness. The farmer sometimes noticed her looking at him with an expression that hinted at vulnerability, and he resisted the urge to reach out immediately. He understood that trust had to be earned, not demanded. Similarly, the widow sometimes caught herself studying his reactions, wondering if he could truly see beyond the surface, if he could understand the quiet loneliness she carried with her. The village continued to gossip, as it always did. Some villagers were surprised to see her working diligently, others refused to believe she had changed. Yet slowly, the opinions began to shift. People who had once avoided her now nodded politely when they passed. Children who had been scared of her began to approach cautiously, curious about her presence on the farm. Though she did not seek approval, these small changes brought a quiet satisfaction. She was proving, without words, that people could be more than the labels others placed upon them. By the end of the second week, the farmer realized that their relationship had grown in ways he had not anticipated. What had started as a simple arrangement, work for food, had evolved into something more complex and meaningful. He found himself considering her well-being, her comfort, and her thoughts as if they were his own. He had come to rely on her presence, not just for the labor she provided, but for the sense of balance and calm she brought to the farm. For her part, the widow began to feel a sense of purpose she had not known since her husband's death. The work was hard the days long, but it was honest and fulfilling. More importantly, she felt seen. For the first time in years, someone had looked at her and not seen a label or a rumor, but a human being with experiences, strengths, and the capacity to give and receive care. The small moments, sharing a meal, laughing quietly at a story, working side by side, began to build a bridge of trust between them. As the sun set on the 14th day, the farmer walked to the barn, carrying a small lantern. He watched her tending to the animals, her silhouette framed by the warm light. There was a quiet dignity in her movements, a grace shaped by years of survival and resilience. The farmer realized that the woman before him was not only capable of hard work, but also of inspiring trust, loyalty, and even admiration. He felt a growing warmth in his heart, a recognition that this was only the beginning of a bond that might change both of their lives in ways neither could yet imagine. And so, life on the farm continued, each day blending hard work with moments of quiet understanding. The widow, once feared and judged, was slowly becoming a valued presence. The farmer, once wary and cautious, was learning to trust, to respect, and to appreciate the quiet strength of a woman who had endured so much. Together, they faced the challenges of the farm, the whispers of the village, and the uncertainties of life with a growing sense of partnership and companionship. The days on the farm were growing longer and busier as the seasons began to change. The sun rose earlier, casting a warm, golden glow over the fields, and the air was filled with the scent of earth and growing crops. The widow continued her daily routines with quiet dedication, moving from task to task with precision and care. She fed the animals, repaired fences, tended to the vegetable garden, and helped the farmer with the harvest. Yet despite her efficiency, it was not just her work that began to capture the farmer's attention. It was the small ways she noticed things, the quiet kindness she showed, and the patience that seemed endless. One morning, a soft breeze carried the smell of rain, and the clouds overhead turned a heavy gray. The farmer had planned to repair a section of the barn roof that had started to leak, but he knew it would be a difficult and tiring job. The widow approached him quietly, carrying a basket of tools she had prepared herself. "We should start before the rain," she said simply. There was no command in her voice, only calm practicality. The farmer nodded, impressed by her foresight and initiative. Together they climbed the ladder, working side by side, fixing the roof with care and precision. As they worked, the farmer began to notice more than her skill. He noticed the way her eyes focused on the smallest details, the way her hands moved confidently, and the way she spoke softly when explaining her plans. It was clear she had faced hardships that had taught her resilience, yet there was also a gentleness in her nature that few had seen. He realized that the villagers' judgments had been shallow and unfair. They had ignored the depth of her character, the kindness she could offer, and the strength she carried quietly within herself. The rain began to fall, first as a light drizzle and then in heavier sheets. They hurried to secure the roof and the tools, slipping occasionally on the wet surfaces, but neither complained. Once inside the barn, they stood together, soaked and tired, yet feeling a sense of accomplishment. The widow smiled faintly, shaking a few droplets from her hair, and the farmer could not help but return the smile. In that small moment, the tension that had existed between them began to fade. There was a quiet understanding forming, a recognition of shared effort, trust, and mutual respect. After the storm passed, they returned to the farmhouse. The widow began preparing a simple meal, and the farmer watched her move with ease in the kitchen. She worked without fuss, chopping vegetables, boiling water, and stirring the pot with calm focus. He could see the care she put into every step, and it reminded him of the warmth and effort one could offer to life and to others when driven by genuine care rather than obligation. Over the next few days, small conversations began to deepen their understanding of each other. One evening, As they sat by the fire after finishing the day's work, the widow shared stories of her past, not in a way that sought sympathy, but simply as facts of her life. She spoke of her husband, a gentle man who had passed too soon, leaving her alone in a village that was often cold and judgmental. She spoke of the years she had spent struggling to survive, finding small jobs and enduring the harsh whispers of neighbors. The farmer listened carefully, realizing that her life had been far more difficult than he had imagined. He shared some of his own struggles as well. Running the farm alone had been exhausting, filled with uncertainty and constant worry about the crops and animals. He admitted that he had sometimes felt lonely, even in the presence of neighbors, because no one truly understood the burden he carried. Their conversation was not heavy or sorrowful, but quiet and honest. For the first time, they were not employer and worker, nor stranger and outcast. They were two people who had faced hardship and found some understanding in one another. As the weeks passed, they continued to work together seamlessly. The widow often anticipated the farmer's needs, fetching tools before he asked, repairing equipment before it broke, and tending to the animals with quiet care. The farmer, in turn, began to rely on her judgment and experience. There was a growing sense of partnership, a rhythm that had developed naturally through shared labor and mutual respect. One afternoon, as they were walking through the fields, the widow noticed a section of crops that had been damaged by heavy wind during the previous night. Without hesitation, she suggested a plan to salvage what remained. "We can replant these," she said, pointing to the broken stalks. "It will take time, but it is worth it. We cannot waste what we have." The farmer agreed, admiring her foresight and practicality. Together, they worked long into the evening, replanting the damaged crops and reinforcing the soil. The physical work was exhausting, yet there was a quiet satisfaction in their teamwork. It was during moments like these that the farmer began to see the depth of the widow's character. She was not only capable and intelligent, but also compassionate. She cared for the farm as if it were her own, and her concern extended to the farmer as well. On particularly hot days, she would fetch extra water for him without asking. She would remind him to rest when he pushed himself too hard, and she would quietly offer encouragement when he felt discouraged. Her actions spoke more than words ever could, and the farmer realized that he had begun to trust her completely. Trust, however, was not the only emotion growing between them. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, a deeper connection began to form. They would share small smiles when a task was completed successfully, exchange laughter at minor accidents, and sometimes, without speaking, find comfort in each other's presence. The farmer found himself noticing her expressions, the way her eyes brightened when she was proud of her work, or how she seemed to carry a quiet sadness when thinking of her past. He began to feel protective of her, wanting to ensure she felt safe and respected on the farm. One evening, after a particularly long day, the widow and the farmer found themselves sitting on the porch, watching the sunset. The sky was painted with shades of pink and orange, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the nearby trees. She leaned back, letting out a small sigh of contentment. "It is peaceful here," she said softly. "I did not know a place like this existed, where work and life can be simple and honest." The farmer nodded, understanding her meaning. Life on the farm was hard, but it was real, honest, and grounding. It allowed for moments of reflection and connection that were often absent elsewhere. The widow paused for a moment, her eyes meeting his. There was a vulnerability in her gaze, a hint of hope that had been buried for years under fear and judgment. The farmer felt a warmth in his chest, an acknowledgement of the quiet bond they had formed. It was not spoken, but both understood that something had shifted. The trust between them had grown into something deeper, a recognition of shared humanity, of mutual respect, and perhaps the beginnings of affection. As the days continued, their interactions became more personal. The widow would ask about the farmer's childhood, his dreams, and even his small fears. He, in turn, began to share stories of his family, his successes and failures, and the moments that had shaped him into the man he was today. They discovered similarities in their experiences of loss, of being misunderstood, and of learning to survive despite life's hardships. These conversations, though simple, were profound. They created a foundation of understanding and empathy that neither had expected to find. The villagers, meanwhile, began to notice the change in her. While gossip and judgment had not disappeared entirely, there were signs that people were starting to see her differently. Some nodded politely when passing by, others offered small gestures of kindness, and a few even asked for her advice regarding farm work. The widow did not seek their approval, but the subtle shift in perception added a quiet sense of validation to her life. She was no longer defined solely by the past or by the rumors. She was being recognized for her present actions and character. By the end of the third week, the widow and the farmer had established a rhythm that combined work, trust, and growing companionship. They faced challenges together, celebrated small victories, and supported each other through setbacks. The initial tension and wariness had been replaced by mutual respect and understanding, and the first real hints of emotional closeness had begun to appear. What had started as a simple arrangement of work for food was now evolving into a partnership built on shared effort, trust, and quiet affection. As the sun set on yet another day, the farmer watched the widow tending to the animals, her movements calm and sure. He realized that she had become more than just a helper. She was a presence that brought life, warmth, and stability to the farm. In her, he had found not only trust and companionship, but also the possibility of healing, hope, and perhaps a future that neither of them had dared to imagine before. The farm had changed a lot since the widow had first arrived. The fields were greener, the animals healthier, and the barn stronger than it had been in years. But more than that, there was a new sense of life and energy on the farm, a quiet warmth that had not existed before. The farmer noticed it most in the small moments. The way the widow smiled when the chickens followed her across the yard, the care she took to repair a fence before it became a problem, and the gentle way she spoke to the cows, as if understanding their needs without words. It was during one of the early mornings of autumn that the widow showed just how deeply she had begun to care for the farm and for the farmer himself. A sudden gust of wind had torn part of the roof from the barn, and rainwater had started to drip onto the hay. Without a moment's hesitation, she gathered tools and tarps, calling the farmer to help secure the structure before more damage was done. Together, they worked quickly, climbing ladders and holding the tarps steady as the wind howled around them. By the time the rain eased, the barn was safe, the hay dry, and the animals secure. The farmer watched her, impressed not just by her skill but by the fearlessness she displayed in moments of crisis. He realized she had become indispensable, not only to the farm but to his daily life. After the storm, they returned to the farmhouse, soaked and tired. The widow began preparing a warm meal and the farmer offered to help, though she shook her head with a quiet smile. "You've done enough today," she said, her eyes showing a rare softness. As they ate, the farmer felt a growing connection to her, a bond that went beyond gratitude for her help. She was no longer just the widow who had come seeking food. She was a companion, someone he could rely on, and someone who had slowly begun to occupy his thoughts even during the busiest hours. Days passed and their routine continued, but now there was a subtle change in their interactions. They laughed together over small mistakes, shared quiet moments of rest on the porch, and even discussed simple dreams about the farm and life beyond it. The widow spoke of planting a small flower garden near the farmhouse, imagining the colors and scents that could brighten the yard. The farmer, who had never considered such things before, found himself helping her plan, offering suggestions, and appreciating the idea of beauty beyond practicality. In these small exchanges, a gentle intimacy began to form, one built on trust, shared labor, and a growing understanding of each other's hearts. One evening, after a long day of work, the widow sat quietly in the kitchen peeling vegetables for the evening meal. The farmer entered, carrying a basket of apples he had picked from a nearby tree. Without a word, he handed her the basket. She looked up at him, a faint blush on her cheeks, and nodded with a smile. That simple exchange carried more meaning than either of them could express aloud. It was an acknowledgement of partnership, of care, and of a bond that had begun to grow stronger than either had anticipated. As autumn deepened, the villagers began to notice a change as well. Though some continued their quiet gossip, many could see that the widow was different from the woman they had once feared. She was no longer withdrawn or cold. She was confident in her work, kind in her actions, and respected for her dedication. Some even offered polite greetings, though still careful, as if unsure how to interact with her now that her reputation had begun to shift. The widow, however, paid little attention to their opinions. Her focus was on the farm and on the quiet moments she shared with the farmer, the one person who had seen her true character without judgment. The farmer, too, began to notice changes in himself. He found comfort in her presence, joy in her laughter, and a sense of peace in the routine they shared. One chilly morning, as they worked together to clear fallen leaves from the yard, he felt a warmth in his chest as he watched her move gracefully among the trees. The way she smiled when she discovered a particularly large leaf or laughed softly when a squirrel darted past seemed to make even the cold air feel gentle. He realized that he was beginning to care for her deeply, though he was unsure how to express it. Their companionship grew in small but meaningful ways. On evenings when the chores were done, they would sit together by the fire, sharing stories, ideas, and memories. The widow spoke of her childhood, of the simple joys she had experienced before tragedy had struck, and of the lessons she had learned through hardship. The farmer listened, fascinated by her resilience and wisdom. In return, he shared his own experiences, revealing moments of vulnerability he had never spoken of to anyone else. In these exchanges, trust deepened, and emotional intimacy began to blossom. One particularly cold evening, the widow discovered that one of the barn animals had fallen ill. She stayed by the animal's side, tending to it through the night, while the farmer watched silently. Her dedication, patience, and compassion were extraordinary. When the animal finally stabilized, the farmer approached her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. She looked up, surprised by the gesture, and he offered a small smile. "You have a kind heart," he said softly. "I am grateful for you." She met his gaze, understanding the depth of his words, and for the first time, she allowed herself to feel a quiet warmth that was not tied to work or survival. Over the following weeks, subtle gestures of care became more frequent. The farmer would bring her warm tea during chilly mornings, and she would prepare extra food for him without being asked. They began to share more personal moments, quiet walks through the fields, gentle conversations about dreams and fears, and evenings spent simply enjoying each other's company. The trust and respect that had formed during hard labor were now evolving into emotional intimacy, a connection neither had expected but both felt deeply. One evening, as the sun set in a sky painted with pink and orange hues, the widow paused while walking across the yard. She looked back at the farmhouse, her eyes catching the soft light reflecting on the windows. The farmer approached, noticing the expression on her face. "What are you thinking?" he asked gently. She hesitated, then spoke quietly. "I am thinking that I feel safe here, that I can rest without fear, and that perhaps I belong." The farmer felt a rush of warmth and understanding. He realized that she had begun to trust him completely, and in that trust, a bond had formed that went beyond mere companionship. The villagers' opinions continued to shift, slowly but noticeably. They saw the widow working diligently, speaking kindly to the animals, and sharing quiet moments with the farmer. Even those who had once feared her began to approach with cautious respect. Some children who had previously run away at her approach now watched her curiously, and occasionally she would smile at them, offering small gestures of kindness. Her presence on the farm was no longer a subject of fear or gossip. It was a testament to her strength, resilience, and growing place in the community. As autumn gave way to early winter, the farmhouse itself began to feel warmer, not just from the fire in the hearth, but from the companionship that filled its walls. The widow and the farmer shared quiet evenings together, sometimes talking, sometimes simply sitting in comfortable silence. Each day, each small act of care and kindness brought them closer. The trust that had begun with work had grown into understanding, and understanding was blossoming into the first hints of affection. One evening, as snow began to fall gently outside, the widow and the farmer finished the last chores of the day. They stood by the barn door, watching the flakes settle softly on the ground. She shivered slightly, and the farmer instinctively offered his coat. She accepted with a faint smile, and for a long moment they stood close together, feeling the quiet warmth of each other's presence. In that simple gesture, the bond between them deepened, trust, respect, care, and the beginnings of love intertwining in a way neither had anticipated. The farm, once a place of struggle and isolation, had become a space of connection, trust, and quiet joy. The widow, once feared and shunned by the villagers, was now a respected and integral part of the life she had chosen on the farm. The farmer, who had once been cautious and reserved, had discovered a companion, a partner, and someone whose presence brought him peace and hope. Together, they navigated the challenges of the land, the whispers of the village, and the growing understanding of each other's hearts. And so life continued on the farm, a life filled with work, laughter, quiet reflection, and the beginnings of a bond that promised more than survival. It promised companionship, trust, and the gentle warmth of hearts opening to one another. The widow and the farmer had crossed the line from wary partnership into a connection that neither could ignore, and both felt the promise of a future that, though uncertain, was bright with hope. Winter had fully arrived, painting the farm in white. Snow blanketed the fields, and the trees were heavy with frost. The farmhouse glowed warmly against the cold, a refuge from the harsh world outside. Inside, life had taken on a comforting rhythm. The widow and the farmer moved through their days in harmony, tending to the animals, checking the firewood, and maintaining the fields as best they could in the winter cold. But beyond the work, there was a new warmth growing in their hearts, a quiet closeness that had developed over months of shared labor, trust, and understanding. The widow had settled fully into life on the farm. No longer the fearful, misunderstood woman the villagers once avoided, she had become a part of the farm itself. The animals responded to her gentle care, the farm thrived under her diligence, and even the villagers had begun to see her differently. They approached her politely now, some even asking for advice about their own gardens or livestock. But her focus remained on the farm and the farmer, whose presence had become central to her life. She felt a sense of belonging she had never known before, and the warmth of that connection filled her with quiet joy. The farmer, too, noticed the change in himself. His once solitary life had been full of worry, loneliness, and endless work, but now there was companionship, laughter, and shared purpose. He began to care for the widow in ways he had not expected, bringing her warm tea in the mornings, offering his coat on cold days, and making small gestures to show that her presence mattered deeply to him. He had come to rely on her not just for her work, but for the calm, thoughtful, and compassionate presence she brought to every aspect of the farm. One evening, as they sat by the fire after a long day of chores, the widow spoke softly. "I never imagined life could be like this," she said, her eyes reflecting the warm glow of the fire. "I thought I would always be alone, carrying my past and fears with me, but now I feel safe. I feel like I belong." The farmer reached out, gently taking her hand in his. "You do belong," he said quietly. "Not just here, but in my life. You have brought light and warmth where there was only struggle before." The widow's eyes filled with emotion, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to feel fully seen, understood, and valued. Their companionship deepened further as winter progressed. Mornings were spent tending to the animals, afternoons repairing equipment and preparing for the next season, and evenings filled with quiet conversation or shared meals. They laughed together over small mistakes, celebrated successes, and comforted each other during moments of doubt or fatigue. Through it all, a subtle romantic bond began to form, though it was never forced or rushed. It grew naturally from trust, respect, and the many small gestures of care and understanding that had become part of their daily lives. One particularly snowy evening, the widow had stayed late in the barn to ensure the animals were safe and warm. The farmer found her there, brushing snow off the windows and checking the feed. Without speaking, he offered to help, and together they completed the chores more quickly than expected. As they stepped out into the cold night, the snowflakes falling gently around them, the farmer took her hand. "It is cold tonight," he said, a hint of tenderness in his voice. She smiled, letting him pull her closer for warmth. In that moment, words were unnecessary. Their connection spoke for itself, a promise of care, trust, and perhaps love. The days following that evening were filled with subtle closeness. They shared more moments of physical proximity, a touch on the shoulder, a hand held briefly during chores, sitting close by the fire while the wind howled outside. These small gestures, though simple, were profound to both of them. They symbolized the trust and emotional bond that had grown between them, a bond that had begun months earlier with work and now flourished into something deeper. As winter slowly gave way to early spring, the farm itself seemed to reflect the changes in their lives. Crops began to show signs of growth under the careful preparation they had done the previous season. The animals thrived under their shared care. Even the villagers, who had once feared and shunned the widow, now respected her deeply. They could see the transformation not only in the farm's success, but also in the way the two worked together, supporting and trusting one another. One morning, the widow woke early, as she always did, to feed the animals. She noticed the farmer quietly preparing the barn, his actions steady and calm. She approached him with a small smile, offering a warm cup of tea. He accepted it gratefully, and for a moment they stood side by side, drinking in silence, watching the sun rise over the snowy fields. In that quiet moment, the bond between them felt complete, rooted in shared work, trust, care, and a deep understanding of each other's hearts. The villagers' changing opinions became even more apparent during the spring festival. People approached the widow with genuine friendliness, some even expressing admiration for her work and the positive influence she had on the farm. Children played near her without fear, and neighbors exchanged smiles of respect. Though she did not seek recognition, the acknowledgement of her efforts added to her sense of belonging. She had transformed from a lonely widow feared by all into a valued, respected, and loved member of the community. The farmer, watching these interactions, felt a profound sense of gratitude and joy. He realized that the companionship he had found with the widow had changed him, not only making the farm thrive, but also enriching his own heart and life. He began to imagine a future where they shared more than work, where their bond could grow into a partnership not just of necessity, but of choice and affection. One evening, as they sat together by the fire after finishing the day's work, the widow looked at the farmer with a soft, hesitant expression. I never thought I would find someone who truly understands me," she said quietly. "Someone who sees me not as the village sees me, but as I really am." The farmer reached out, gently taking her hand. "I see you," he said simply. "I have seen you from the beginning, and I am grateful for every moment we have shared." The widow's eyes filled with tears of quiet happiness, and for the first time in years, she felt completely safe and accepted. In the weeks that followed, their relationship became more openly affectionate, though always respectful and gentle. They shared meals, stories, and laughter, but also moments of silence, simply enjoying each other's presence. The farm continued to flourish under their combined care, and the bond between them grew stronger with each passing day. It was a partnership built on trust, understanding, and a quiet love that had developed slowly, but surely, proving that patience, respect, and shared hardship could create a connection deeper than either had imagined. Finally, one crisp spring morning, after the first buds had appeared on the trees, the widow and the farmer stood together in the fields, looking over the land they had nurtured. She leaned slightly against him, and he placed his arm around her shoulders. "We have come a long way," she said softly, a gentle smile on her face. "From loneliness and fear to this." The farmer nodded, feeling a deep warmth in his heart. "Yes," he replied, "from strangers to companions. And I hope from now on we continue together." The widow rested her head lightly against his shoulder, a symbol of trust, comfort, and the quiet love that had grown between them. The villagers, noticing the closeness of the two, no longer whispered behind their backs. They had seen the widow transformed, not just through her work on the farm, but through the bond she shared with the farmer. Their partnership was a living example of trust, kindness, and understanding, and it slowly inspired others to reconsider the way they judged people based on rumor and fear. Life on the farm had changed forever. The widow, once lonely and feared, was now a central figure, loved and respected, with a partner who valued her completely. The farmer, once isolated and cautious, had found companionship, trust, and a gentle love that filled the spaces of his heart he had long thought empty. Together, they faced the future with hope, knowing that their bond was strong enough to endure challenges, celebrate victories, and create a life filled with care, warmth, and mutual respect. And so, the story of the lonely widow and the farmer reached a new beginning. It was a beginning defined not just by survival or work, but by connection, trust, and the quiet blossoming of love. The farm, once a place of struggle and isolation, had become a home filled with warmth and life, where two hearts found each other and discovered that even the loneliest souls could find companionship, understanding, and the promise of a shared future.